Go ahead, Lee.
Okay, so welcome to night school. Just want to say a little bit about it. We're all here for the struggle, for the fight to change things. But as we do that fight, we have to learn to do it better each time. And we look at our narrow work, but we also look broadly at the history of the struggle for socialism. And by doing that together, we become more unified. And when new things come up, we have our bearings and have a similar point of view. So we've been doing night school for, I think, 4 years now. We're going to have a review of night school. Next year, we're going to have more political education. We're not exactly sure if it's going to be night school, but we ask you to participate, to put in your thoughts, and to be part of the process. So welcome.
Thank you, Lee, and thanks everyone for joining us. Tonight, we're so happy to be hosting Aziz Rana, who will talk to us about imperialism and foreign policy. And just a little bit about Aziz first. Aziz teaches law at Cornell University. His work centers on American constitutional law and political development, with a particular focus on how shifting notions of race, citizenship, and empire have shaped legal and political identity since the founding. He's the author of the book, The Two Faces of American Freedom. His forthcoming manuscript explores the modern rise of constitutional veneration in the United States, especially against the backdrop of growing American global authority, and how veneration has influenced the boundaries of popular politics. So with that, I will hand it over to Aziz. Welcome, Aziz. Thank you so much for joining us, and we're eager to hear what you have to say.
Thanks so much. Thank you for that, that very kind introduction, Carrington, and thank you for all of the organizing work and getting this event set up. So thanks to you, to Lee, and to Doug. It's a real pleasure to be here by Zoom to have this conversation. As I said before, hopefully one of these days before too long in person too. So my understanding is that I'm going to speak for maybe about 30 minutes and just sort of lay out some kind of big picture questions and themes, and then we can open it up for conversation. In particular, I was asked to talk about the relationship between American imperialism and the domestic US order. And I'm going to try to do that by focusing on two different kinds of topics. So the first thing that I'm going to discuss is what I view as the kind of long-standing relationship in American history between a kind of limited or truncated version of social democracy. So some degree of social mobility, economic opportunity, economic security, and the conditions of American empire. How, in point of fact, one of the most common ways of organizing the relationship between empire and domestic politics is through linking a version of expansionism with some account of social democracy. And then I'm going to discuss that as well as its limitations and also essentially contemporary collapse, and then turn in the second part to elaborating where I see left politics as fitting in and what are the particular challenges for really presenting something like a genuine left alternative in the present, given the breakdown of what's been the most common way of organizing the relationship between American power and domestic order. So that's how I'm sort of thinking about my framing. All right. The first thing to note, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this, is that the idea that there are real material economic benefits for insiders, for members of the US polity that come with the projection of American power is very deeply ingrained in the American experience. If we were having this conversation in the 19th century, this would be a conversation about settler colonialism in point of fact. So if you take Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, one of the things that he notes but doesn't really give an account of is that throughout the 19th century, even through the sort of like the most extreme moments of the Gilded Age, economic inequality in the US remains significantly lower than in Europe. So he doesn't explain why, but there's a fairly clear answer for why there's relatively more white male egalitarianism. And that's the fact of territorial expansion, the expropriation of indigenous land, the quote unquote settling of the West and the transformation of what had been a political landmass occupied by many different nations into something that is exclusively the provide of the US state, combined with then at the same time the coercive extraction of Black and other non-white labor. This provides the condition for internal economic equality for some. And so that there is a story of what amounts to economic populism that's very clearly connected to imperial frameworks. There is a resonance between this approach in the 19th century and what emerges in the mid-20th century, especially post-World War II. And that's really what I'm going to focus on. So the rise of the post-World War II American order, both at home and abroad, and then its breakdown in more recent times. What happens after World War II? So following World War II, essentially the global economy is devastated. The European empires have been totally destroyed. And the US emerges essentially as the dominant economic, political, and military player. And it increasingly comes to justify, at least the leaders in the country, justify this position through an account of an American exceptionalism, namely that the US from the founding has been rooted in principles of liberty and equality, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and that American history is therefore very much connected to the general provision of democratic self-government, both within the country's boundaries, but for all. And this means that it has uniquely combined a set of values. So principles of equality, democratic governance, constitutionalism, but also of market capitalism that make it an appropriate model for how all international relationships should be organized. And so the US basically then constructs a multinational order that's supposed to be based on constitutionalism, rule following, that applies at the international level through institutions like the Bretton Woods arrangements, but also the UN, but then also supposed to proliferate comparatively across the globe within sort of the nation state frameworks of foreign countries. So this is the vision. Now, part of what makes the US supposedly exceptional is that in this kind of framework, there still needs to be somebody that actually secures what amounts to the rule of law and collective frameworks, ensures that actually democracy and peace organize the international community. And the argument that officials make is precisely because of the historical founding of the country and principles of liberty and equality, the US is uniquely situated to serve as that backstop, so that it alone, therefore, ends up having this specific role on the world stage, which is it establishes a rule governing framework, but it can also step inside and outside of those legal obligations. In other words, it enjoys something like an international police power to ensure that disorder hasn't erupted anywhere in the globe, and if necessary, to intervene to reconstruct the domestic relationships in foreign countries. And this is the heart, really, of 20th century American imperialism, which is if you enjoy this international police power, that means that you have a continuous right of intervention that is not constrained by any actual overarching framework. So the US is supposed to be able to step inside and outside of the legal order, and it's the thing that actually promotes or protects the world framework. That's the argument. Now, as we know, what this meant throughout the Cold War was a defense of various forms of assassinations, coups. I heard earlier that you had Vincent Bevins come and talk about the Cold War experience in places like Indonesia. And so there's a way in which this is a justification for a rule following framework that nonetheless is also has embedded within it a sustained commitment to the violation of norms and to the assertion of various forms of violence and power. Now, this approach on the international stage had very clear domestic effects. In other words, there was a very specific way in which what we can think of as 20th century American empire nonetheless connected again to a limited account of social democracy at home. Precisely because of the US's dominant position, the fact that its currency becomes effectively the reserve currency for the global economy, its status as capable of stepping inside and outside of institutional arrangements means that it can intervene to reconstruct foreign states, to open up markets to American products. All of this creates during World War II and after World War II a domestic economic boom. It generates massive material opportunities such that this produces real transformative changes in the life and experience of working class, especially white, but not exclusively white families. It's why Jefferson Cowie in his book Staying Alive about the working class in the 1970s quotes the son of a steelworker who reflects on the 1950s to say that, quote, if liberation, what we experienced in the 1950s in terms of the dramatic improvements in material experience was not liberation, then liberation never took place in human lives. In other words, that the status of the US on the global stage has these reverberating effects domestically. And these reverberating effects also entrench the New Deal settlement. It means that the New Deal settlement of that mid-20th century period is fundamentally an imperial settlement. And this is why. So part of what's going on during this time is that labor accepts a kind of compromise with both state and business. And this compromise says that rather than focusing, for example, on internationalist concerns, like during World War II, opposition to the war effort, or developing something like an independent foreign policy based on working class interests, foreign policy will be left to state experts. And rather than seeking economic democracy, the reconstruction basically of the industrial infrastructure so that workers have more direct control over the means of production, that basic questions of managerial prerogative will be left to business elites, and that labor unions will primarily focus on bargaining over various kinds of material benefits. Moreover, connected to this, rather than assuming that things like healthcare will be viewed as universal public goods provided by government, the simple largesse of American power overseas, the wealth that's being generated by the expansion of corporate authority globally, means that these will be viewed as private benefits. There'll be a private social welfare state that you bargain for at work. Like you get your healthcare at work because, hey, business is booming and what's good for General Motors is good for you as a worker. All of this sets the terms for what amounts to this mid-century compact. And I want you to notice two really key things about it: the privatization of social welfare on the one hand, and the cleavage of domestic and foreign. So domestic is a matter of bread and butter issues, and that might be something that you as a US citizen can intercede in. It might be something that you as a member of a union might be able to, press in Congress or work for when you're engaged in collective bargaining with business. But it doesn't interfere with the basic prerogatives of foreign policy that's associated with the Cold War state. The Cold War state has its own insulated security structure that reaches the principal determinations about how foreign policy is organized. Now, what happens to all of this? There are two kind of related stories. The first story is a story basically of what you can think of as defeat in victory for the American post-World War II order, which is when the Soviet Union collapses. In a way, the hegemonic alternative of the Soviet Union liberates American elites from the kinds of constraints that actually produce some degree of rule following. And the story really of the last 30 years has been a steady defection of the US from the very rules that it established. The US was always stepping inside and outside the legal order, but increasingly as the only relevant political actor, what ends up happening is that you have more and more American politicians across both parties that essentially commit to acting in unilateral ways. So you have, the bombing in Kosovo, the bombing in the 90s in Iraq after the first Gulf War, the response to 9/11, the kind of unilateral war of choice in Iraq, the defection from various kinds of international treaties and arrangements, participating in writing the Rome Statute that deals with international criminal law, but refusing to actually sign up to it. So that there's a general story of defection that ends up essentially over time, over the course of 30 years, unraveling the very foundations of the order. And at the same time, what you also have happen is that the close connection between business interests and the national security state's Cold War approach and that post-war order means that much of the international economic framework is really built on making transnational corporate property rights, creating what amounts to an international legal frame that allows corporations to be footloose, while at the same time constraining the movement of labor. So this is all of the stuff around various kinds of, negotiated international trade deals, but tax havens, limitations on the capacity of foreign states to be able to intervene in establishing various kinds of labor and environmental regulations. The effect is a powerful project that, again, is also accelerated after the collapse of the Soviet Union, of what amounts to global privatization, neoliberal austerity, that ends up having these reverberating effects domestically. Footloose capital means that, hey, if your healthcare is based on the company, but the company can move, and maybe it can move to another place in the US, but maybe it can move overseas, then essentially workers end up fighting over a truncated pie as corporations become increasingly more committed to profits. And so you have a situation where the kind of business conservatism that gets projected internationally comes to essentially end up eating away at what remained of that limited social welfarist, social democratic arrangement, that settlement from the mid 20th century. And so here you have a situation where empire, in a way, is both the condition for some degree of social democracy, but ends up actually fundamentally undermining its fulfillment in a way that really highlights something that I'll return to, that you cannot have a genuinely democratic socialist or emancipatory economic policy domestically within the US without actually confronting the nature of American power and how that power is constructed through both the security state and a set of capitalist global arrangements. So all of this produces a contemporary moment where you would think, let's say over the last few years, that this would be especially auspicious for the revival, not just of left domestic politics, but also of a kind of left foreign policy. That before the onset really of the Cold War, there had been very powerful traditions of left internationalism that said that working people or Black people that are engaged in struggle, their primary sites of community solidarity are not with co-nationals, powerful co-nationals or the security state, but instead with other communities that are facing similar forms of oppression. So workers abroad or folks engaged in anti-colonial struggle elsewhere. And this means that the labor movement or the Black freedom struggle or other kinds of socialist political projects have to develop independent foreign policies distinct from the framework of the established security state. And so that had been a really powerful argument. That argument is not entirely, but to a significant degree, contained in the context of Cold War crackdowns, as well as sort of the sense of success that the Cold War project actually provided domestically, both on economic and civil rights grounds. But to the extent that we've reached a point over the last decade where both the international order and the perceived benefits of that international order domestically have crumbled, you would think that this would be a way to revive left politics and that kind of left internationalism. And indeed, I think actually we've seen a fair amount of this. Not, perhaps to the extent that existed during parts of the Cold War or before the Cold War, but I think it has been noteworthy that with the rise of the movement for Black Lives, that there's been an effort to connect, for example, the critique of policing in places like Ferguson to US policy in Israel, Palestine, and places like Gaza, that it's significant that those racial justice protests have been tied to kind of internationalist perspective, that the vision statement movement for Black Lives in 2016 and more recently can combine invest and divest. You can say the same thing certainly about DSA and the extent to which DSA politics has attempted very seriously to engage in complicated ways with like international questions. But nonetheless, it's still the case that there isn't a kind of sustained political articulation of a left internationalist politics that begins from anti-imperialist grounds and that is connected in a meaningful way to an account of domestic life that is just part of the conversations that we have ordinarily in the general public sphere. And so here's where I think I'm going to spend the rest of my time, which is, well, why is it if the combination of empire and a kind of limited social democratic framework domestically has more or less broken down, that this moment has been in some ways more auspicious for a Trumpist style belligerent America First nationalism than for a kind of anti-imperial left internationalism. And I think that there are some significant hurdles that I'm just going to articulate, and maybe in conversation we can work through what they mean and how they play out, including in some of the more recent discussions, both around the withdrawal in Afghanistan and obviously more recently, Russia's imperial invasion in Ukraine. All right. The first, I think, has to do with the difficulty of confronting the national security state. And this plays out in a couple different ways. The first way it plays out is that the success in the past of left-wing foreign policy has historically been when you have movements that can articulate anti-imperial demands in domestic material terms. In other words, can say, hey, you know, this war in like the First World War, this is an effort to actually improve the profits of capitalists in ways that will, in fact, undermine the capacity of workers at home to assert control of the point of production. Or you could have a number of other examples. But the systematic cleavage of foreign and domestic means that oftentimes when left activists and political voices attempt to intervene to criticize the security state, to say, hey, the budget for the Defense Department should be reduced, this reads less as making materialist demands in international terms. In other words, it's something that is just, part of the general construction of how movement politics articulates positions that people understand, and instead is read as kind of interceding into expert arenas where, there are these think tanks, and these think tanks work through like which kinds of programs are necessary and how to construct like a counterterrorism budget. And none of this feels necessarily like it's of a piece with movement politics. To the extent that we've had sustained movement politics around confronting the national security state, it's almost always been in the context of wars as an anti-war claim. So it's, the Iraq War, for instance. And the issue there is that, actual boots on the ground American wars are only a piece of a larger infrastructure of what the national security state does. And so having that as the exclusive way in which you can make these kinds of movement demands is a relatively limited approach. And it's also a relatively limited approach in a context in which the military itself is now essentially a volunteer army. And so there's a kind of self-selecting body that kind of depoliticizes it. And also where the military budget and the defense budget in general is one of the last spaces of old style kind of New Deal social spending, where you have to really think, like, if you're going to go after the budget or go after various kinds of programs, what would that mean to those local communities? How do you transform a critique of that kind of spending with an argument about how to invest, for example, in various other types of opportunities? So there's that issue about the nature of confronting the national security state. It also goes hand in hand with the question of, well, if left actors want to say that this state has to be substantially demobilized, like abolish the national security state, like abolish prisons or abolish the police or systematically demobilize it, you have to have an account of how you get from here to there. If you are in fact in charge of various kinds of institutional bureaucracies, even if your goal is, let's say, to eliminate those bureaucracies, like how would you do it? How would you go about getting rid of the Department of Homeland Security, or transforming the nature of like what the intelligence frameworks consist in? These are in fact technical questions, and they require a kind of specificity if the basic confrontation is with a kind of national security framework. Okay, so that's one range of issues that I think has made it especially difficult for the left to intervene, in particular, the continued and historical cleavage of domestic and foreign, where it's still uncomfortable and unfamiliar for people to think of these things as fundamentally interrelated. And then the second, and in some ways I think this is the hardest nut to crack, and it's part of what we've been seeing in the internal left debates over Ukraine. This has to do with internationalism. Like, what does internationalism actually mean in the present? So I presented an argument about like how in different historical moments during the period of decolonization, the 60s and 70s, or in earlier eras of of labor activism. You had an idea of left internationalism that's built on worker solidarity or anti-colonial arrangements. There was an account of what international solidarity consisted in, which was, you as a left person in the United States were in alliance with specific groups that had meaningful popular constituencies and who you could take the lead from in developing something like a coherent foreign policy. So, there was something like the ANC, there was the PLO, there was the FLN. These are organizations, whatever their own internal difficulties, and of course there's always problems about which factions to back or support, that had representative authority within their communities, that spoke on behalf of civil society, and that could provide a kind of network for thinking about the meaning of internationalism. The story of the last half century has been, effectively the disappearance of all of these institutions and their replacement by authoritarian, semi-authoritarian, non-representative in other ways, nation states, where to say that you're in alliance with the ANC is very different than being in alliance, for example, with the government in Zimbabwe. And this issue of international solidarity, like what does it mean to be an internationalist, is a problem for the left that is not a problem for liberal internationalists, which is part of why the contemporary moment is so much harder for the left than for liberals. By this, I mean, if you're a liberal internationalist, you also believe in the idea of like global peace, various kinds of multilateral institutions, et cetera, the classic kind of American exceptional story. You might have a critique of Vietnam or the Iraq War or US actions in Afghanistan, but these are viewed as aberrations. But at the heart, and this is the key thing for liberal internationalism, you believe that the US state is the instrument of relevant transformative change on the global stage. So you actually have a state instrument that is the site of solidaristic attachment. It's the US state, it's the alliances that the US builds, and maybe those should be altered or shifted, but you can identify with the state. That is not the situation that leftists are in, precisely because the point is a critique of the national security framework and an argument that you have to have an independent foreign policy distinct from what the state as currently constructed amounts to. And that then produces two kind of related problems for left internationalism. The first is, if you're suspicious of the US state and you're interested in having solidarities with local communities on the ground that are genuinely articulating self-determination, then you have to work through a basic kind of tension, which is, on the one hand, you have to critique American empire, which is you have to have a basic principle of anti-imperialism, which is that the kinds of interventions the US is engaged in are largely destabilizing of local self-determination. But at the same time, you have to have a critique of authoritarianism. You have to have a politics that's anti-authoritarian. That's like, well, wait a second. I don't like what the US is doing, but Assad is a brutal dictator, and one cannot be in alliance with brutal dictators. And this creates, it's not an impossible, let's say, quandary to solve, but it creates a deep intellectual tension, because you're confronted in a political climate in which both center and left essentially attempt to transform all left arguments into picking sides. So if you critique US empire, you're essentially being pro-authoritarian. And then, of course, I do think that you might have less skillful articulations among leftists about how to navigate this divide, where, might be more hesitant to like forthrightly critique various forms of global authoritarianism because of the concern about American power. But this is a kind of tension that has to be navigated. And it plays out in another sort of related dimension, which is, if you're committed to left internationalism, you're also probably, as a matter of just geopolitical strategy, committed to some version of multipolarity. The American kind of quote unquote century, marked by bipolar connections with the Soviet Union, but the truth is the US is still the hegemonic actor, marked really since the end of the Cold War with unipolarity. And I think a leftist position is that this unipolarity has been, in fact, pretty destructive for large swaths of the global community, and it has not, in fact, produced either the counts of democracy or prosperity across the global South that was supposed to be a foundation of unipolarity, and that instead, most likely, a multipolar set of arrangements where power is distributed to parts of the world that traditionally have not had the ability to actually intervene meaningfully in the construction of the international system, is one that would be more stable, produce greater prosperity, more meaningful self-determination. But here's the catch. Yeah, socialist unipolarity, that's the other alternative. That's a version of, but here's the catch, which is the actual world that we live in right now is one in which the relevant multipolar actors have been forged by the last 30 years of privatization, neoliberal austerity, and oligarchy. And so the relevant multipolar actors are folks like, just oligarchs like Putin in Russia, or an increasingly more stringently authoritarian regime in China, whose own actors are engaged in their own versions of imperial authority. And so without being able to link up very clearly with liberation organizations, like again, PLO, ANC, FLN, you're in this situation where the relevant actors that seem to have authority on the ground are states that are deeply authoritarian. And that if your vision is a multipolar world, well, how do you get to a multipolar world that doesn't then just end up privileging not one version of authoritarianism, of imperialism in the US, but like a system of many imperialisms? And all of this is, I think, what the center left has been able to play on in the context of Ukraine, because it's very easy, even though the basic structure and approach of the post-war order is more or less collapsed, both domestically and internationally, to kind of just go back one last time to that old time religion, to say, well, wait a second, there's an authoritarian state. It's engaged in an imperial intervention that's an invasion that violates principles of self-determination. It is viewed as an adversary in terms of Cold War connections. So invest in the US state as yet again an instrument for kind of reframing the world in ways that are consistent with market capitalism and liberal constitutionalism, and then attack folks basically on right and left that diverge from a commitment to a new Cold War. And all of that is just a very natural way that American politics has functioned. And it puts left, activists, I think, very clearly on the defensive, because, without being able to say, here is the alternative set of multipolar arrangements organized around actors with meaningful state and economic power who can articulate a socialist alternative, how do you both maintain a commitment to anti-imperialism as exercised by any kind of imperialist entity, and yet at the same time avoid sort of falling into support, a kind of like unthinking support for the types of strategies that the US state might pursue in ways that could be belligerent and destructive. For instance, to say it very concretely, how do you oppose what Russia is doing, while at the same time saying that a position as articulated by the US state, which is, well, let's take our sanctions framework, which is essentially economic siege by other means that we've applied to 30 plus countries over the last 3 decades in a variety of different contexts, and then simply fit it in this setting. How do you say that, well, that's actually not a productive way of generating something like a meaningful multilateral and multipolar world, while still figuring out ways and tools to assert kind of solidarity with folks that find themselves facing various forms of invasion and attack? That's not an answer, but that's like the nature of the puzzle. And it's why I think in the context of these debates, it's both the case that the left position, I think, has a real moral power, but faces these very clear political difficulties in being able to articulate their positions within American domestic politics and avoid being caricatured and lambasted by a very established Cold War liberalism that does not work, but that has a deep purchase on the collective psyche. Now, what does that mean for the future? It means that because I don't think the Cold War liberal approach works, just attempting to go back to it again and again, I don't think is a meaningful solution. Like it's broken down, it's not going to succeed. Something else is going to take the place effectively of both the American position on the global stage and also this kind of Cold War liberal center that has marked American politics for a long time. But just because something else is going to take the stage, unless there's a clear articulation and movement politics behind a left alternative, it also doesn't mean that it's the left alternative that we want that'll fill the vacuum. So thanks so much.
Amazing. Thank you so much. As you said, just you raised so many questions and inspire the quest for answers. I think Doug is going to handle our Q&A. Yep, there Doug is saying it. This was terrific. I think we all agree. I think Doug is going to handle our Q&A. If people want to ask questions, you can just write stack in the chat like so. And we will call on you. We do keep a progressive stack, but you know, depending on how many people put themselves on stack, we will go to that or not. Doug, take it away. I see Lee's already on stack. Doug,
Okay, yes, unmuted. Lee, what do you have to?
Sorry. Mia just told me community agreements. I broke from.
Oh, yes.
I'm actually signed up to do community agreements. I don't know if it matters. Doug, you can do them if you want to.
Oh,
No,
go ahead.
go ahead.
I don't have them at my fingertips.
Oh, okay, cool. Hi, everyone. Aziz, thanks again. That was really great. I'm just gonna read some quick community agreements for discussion real quick. Number one, everybody's here to learn, assume good intentions, and be comradely. Two, stack. We use progressive stack. If you have a question, put stack into the chat and we'll call on you. Doug is going to be our stack master tonight. And number three, please be brief with questions. Keep it to around a minute and please keep commentary to a minimum so everyone who wants to be part of the conversation gets a chance to. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, so I believe Lee was first in line.
Okay, so that was an extremely interesting and in-depth approach, and I liked it a lot. But I felt that in some sense, the role of struggle was kind of left out. For instance, the position of post-war, of privilege of post-war working class was just sort of given in your point of view, when in fact there was a amazing wave of strikes post-World War II. There was a lot of class struggle that went on, and that had a lot to do with it. And in fact, if we look at the situation in Ukraine, your layout doesn't give a role to the Ukrainian people, who are in fact the main force here. They are fighting in a way that was unexpected on all fronts. And as socialists, I feel like within a situation where there's lots of power and they have their ideas, for us as socialists, the struggle of the masses, even though it may not be as coherent as we'd like it to be, has to be our main concern in moving that forward. So I wanted you to respond to that. Sorry.
And I assume that I should just respond to each of the questions. So yeah, thank you very much, Lee. I think those are terrific additions, and I think it's just a function of trying to cover a lot that I just simply didn't do justice. to the kind of movement activism that generated the terms of both the domestic settlement, or that speak to what we're seeing right now overseas. So, first with the post-war domestic settlement, you're absolutely correct that without the strike wave from 34 to 36, and then again in 45 to 46, you would not have even the kind of limited version of social democracy that marks the US. And this is something that I think is de-emphasized, frankly, in the present, which is one of the big differences between left politics now and then, and that we're in the process collectively through organizations like DSA of rebuilding, is just the intensity of intermediary institutions in the past that could assert actual direct power over, the point of production or political life. Like in the mid-30s, in fact, bring the economy to a halt. Or in 45, 46, where you had a strike wave that really was at that point kind of unparalleled and was an equal to the strike waves in the mid-30s or in 1919. That's, I think, the right way to think about it. Part of the story of why the settlement was experienced as a form of liberation for many folks in the working class in the 1950s is because it was the culmination of 2 decades of struggle that produced real material gains. But at the same time, I think it's also worthwhile to think from our perspective today about the potential downside of the kinds of accommodations that were ultimately made, even if, we should view this as both a kind of success, but a success that had its own limitations. On Ukraine, I think this is actually a really important point to note, which is the most natural way that, so the most natural way I think that sort of leftists domestically get asked to talk about what's happening overseas is to sort of think in terms of, well, what is it that the US state should do? And it strikes me that I think it's worthwhile to kind of separate out 2 questions. So there's one thing, which is, as like members of the American polity, where there's a powerful national security state that has its own foreign policy objectives, like, well, what should be the demands that we make on that state? Like, what kinds of things should it be doing? And I think there's a variety of different principles that we should articulate, that we would want the state to show a commitment to something like global social democracy, that we want the state to show a commitment to a principle of something like do no harm, where it kind of limits the forms of violence that it projects overseas. We'd want it to show a commitment to something like meaningful self-determination, and that this plays out in the types of policies that we would support or push back against. So, want the state to, perhaps to articulate a defense of Ukrainian self-determination, but to pursue maybe targeted sanctions, close tax haven loopholes, but avoid policies that are essentially a form of general economic siege that might be destructive and harmful for ordinary citizens in places like Russia, and that have no history, as Nick Mulder has shown, of actual success. So there's that question. Then there's another thing, which is left activists are not foreign policy participants in the security state. We're members, to speak of collectively, of a social movement, of an incipient and emergent social movement that wants to make links with similarly situated social movements elsewhere to create something like a grassroots form of solidarity. And then that presents a different kind of approach. Like, we can have one perspective about what we want from the state, but then we can also have another perspective about what kinds of alliances on the ground we want to build with communities that find themselves under threat, whether Ukrainians engaged in resistance or Palestinians pursuing something like BDS in the context of civil society activism. And that's a different way of conceiving of the relevant positionality. And it's also something that makes left social movements differently situated than just kind of liberal Cold Warriors. We're primarily like focused on, hey, the state is the instrument. Let's get the state to do our bidding, either through various forms of humanitarian intervention or pursuing various kinds of strategic alliances. I hope both of those were responsive.
Okay, next in line we have Carrington.
So it seems to me you're saying the left needs both a vision for a new world order and a narrative to go with it. And I know that's a tall order, but just like big picture, that's two things that we kind of need. And I wonder if you thoughts about like the NIEO, the new International Economic Order. I mean, I know some sort of global Green New Deal people are picking that up as a possible vision for how the world could run. Do you think that that's real? Do you know anything about that? And do you think that that's a realistic and maybe productive way to go forward?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And I'm going to try to be quicker so that we can get more questions in. But so the NIEO was the product of non-aligned or third world state actors that had been very closely involved in anti-colonial struggle in the 60s and 70s, and that were trying to think of an alternative basically between US and Soviet frameworks for conceiving of the international system. And in particular, what they were concerned with was the experience that newly independent states faced, which is that they were formally independent, but they were subject to all of these forms of intervention, but also on economic grounds, they didn't have real material control over internal economic, political, and social decision making. And so what they wanted to do was to imagine ideas of federation. So how do you create a multipolar world where you might have various kinds of economic federation, various kinds of multilateral arrangements that allow poor states to essentially have access to global material wealth in ways that would meaningfully redistribute wealth and allow local actors to control economic decision making. There's a set of kind of fairly programmatic positions that were developed in the 70s. If folks are interested in this, I strongly recommend reading the work of Adam Getachew. Her book, World Making After Empire, goes in depth into thinking about the NIEO. And I think that that's obviously these are perspectives that need to be updated for a half century later. But I think that's a really productive, healthy way of conceiving of what a socialist account of multipolarity would be in the present. So we have on offer American unipolarity, or a version of regional power struggles with the US, China, Russia. Neither of these are actually compatible with something like equal and effective freedom for all grounded in democratic socialism. And so we have to be able to think through, well, what have been the historical examples, like the NIEO, of multipolar arrangements based on confederation, multilateralism, demilitarization, something like a global New Deal that meaningfully distributes wealth and thinks of wealth as a shared common resource, as a way of actually like constructing alternatives. I mean, there's a way in which it's utopian, because these are things that have not effectively been tried, but we're facing a variety of different impending cataclysms, from rolling pandemics to the climate catastrophe, that mean that thinking in utopian terms should actually be understood as like the bare minimum of what we have to do in the moment.
Okay, I think we have Mia next.
Yes, thank you so much. This was really great, and I hope my question isn't too similar to one that was already asked, but I'm wondering if you could talk more, like you mentioned, this like difficult balance between anti-imperialism as an ideology and not being anti-authoritarian. But I'm wondering, like, it seems like foreign policy in particular is one of those things, maybe due to like the many layers of removal that Americans often have from other countries, like language barriers, not knowing the cultural history and just regular history. It seems like one of those subjects that you really have to like read, do hours and hours of research on, read all these things before you feel confident taking a particular stance. And obviously that's not something everyone's doing. So like in the socialist left, like within DSA, for example, I don't know if you have any suggestions, obviously, besides like doing that extensive research, how we like catch people up to a point where we have a coherent stance on current events as they evolve, and as they come up, and how we react to things when there's so much history behind every single thing that's hard to wrap your head around in a way that like something like Medicare for all or whatever isn't, doesn't have that intuitive like right answer, I guess, if that makes sense.
So I think that's a great question. I think it's just it's a difficult one. And I will say that this has been a perennial challenge for the left. So I presented, this is something actually that I mentioned even before we formally started or officially started. This has been a perennial challenge for the left. Like, let's say this is the 1930s and you're part of like a, socialist collective that wants to provide support to the Spanish Republicans fighting fascists. Like, which faction are you supposed to be backing? I mean, there's like a communist faction that's connected to the Soviet Union. There's like anarchist groups. There's democratic socialist groups. Or, more recently, this is a big problem that Black freedoms activists had in the 60s and 70s, where there might be competing orientations within an independence movement. So which faction in Angola or in Mozambique are you supposed to be supporting? And then there's all these internal debates, and it requires a really intense degree of knowledge. So it's a perennial problem. It's made harder by the fact that in the present, you don't have these kinds of stalwarts of what amount to international solidarity. Like, you don't have, as Carrington notes, something like the NIEO that's backed by a range of actors where you could say, well, here is a programmatic agenda that has meaningful domestic support that is a product of the global South. And so I think that leads to kind of two things. Like, one is, I think it's part of the reason why one of the things that we can do practically, like, so take, for example, thorny questions, but it could be Ukraine, but like, let's say Syria more recently. It's really hard to know what like civil society group in Syria requesting what kind of support that you as a member of the US left should be in the business of backing, because honestly, these are very complex internal questions within another country. But it is easier to make sense of what your government should be doing. So in other words, it might be the case that if you're a freedom fighter or like an activist on the ground in Syria, that you're like, we should engage in armed resistance, and that's an internal debate, or we need to actually have external support from foreign governments. That's an internal debate about the pluses and minuses. But you in the US, your relationship is to the US state and to an assessment of like, well, what is it likely that the US state is going to do? And so the thing that you can do is you can make specific kinds of claims or demands on the operation of the American state. And at the same time, then you could engage in a kind of general educational project where, just like, liberation schools in the past and left-wing education like this has been about the intricacies of other arenas of profound technical complexity, modern monetary theory, then, education about the terms of comparative global politics. That's actually a significant piece of it. But both of those things can be taking place at the same time, because it's almost always easier to intervene vis-a-vis the relevant power broker that you're in fact in relationship to.
I think Steve is next.
Yes, Aziz, thank you so much for coming. I have a question about, well, Doug mentioned answers. I think that's like something that's on everyone's mind right now with the current crisis in Europe. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on regionalism as something the left should maybe get behind more, in discussing sort of the post-Soviet breakup. I know Chomsky has been discussing Gorbachev's proposal, which was sort of very abortive, of the common European home, which sounds fantastic and impossible right now, just given the facts on the ground. Yeah, I also think of the EU, which is obviously kind of a horrible neoliberal institution. It allows German bankers to call the shots and everything, but at the same time, you have free movement of people, you have the breakdown of these barriers. It's hard to imagine war between France and Germany now. So yeah, I'm wondering if you could just talk more about, should the left get behind regionalism or socialist forms of regionalism?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not like, I'm generally my own politics, and this is not just in foreign policy, tends to be at the philosophical level agnostic as opposed to form. You know, like it's what matters is in political practice, what forms are actually compatible with expanding the meaningful power of those that are oppressed. But, you know, as a general matter, like, you know, when I think about contemporary arrangements and arrangements really since the 80s, that I think that multilateral institutions that take seriously various forms of regionalism, you know, would certainly be preferable. I mean, that's a large part of how the NIEO was conceived of. Like that was understood as a way of building on Pan-Africanism, Pan-Arabism to create broader centers that would allow, you know, regions that are historically economically impoverished to both be able to build up their own economic security and position, and also to be able to maintain a kind of demilitarized set of security arrangements. And, you know, if we think about Gorbachev specifically, Penny von Eschen, amazing historian, has a new book out that's basically about the post-Cold War period. That's a history from more or less 89 to the present. I'm blanking on, I think it's called The Paradoxes of Nostalgia. But she has this amazing quote from Gorbachev relatively recently, maybe in the last decade or so, where he said that the US's problem is that it had a winner's complex. In other words, like it couldn't handle victory. That essentially post 89, his vision, and the vision that was shared by a number of other folks in parts of Eastern and Central Europe and former Soviet bloc, was a vision of demilitarization, multilateral institutions across Europe that were demilitarized and that could actually engage in meaningful economic redistribution to produce something like social democracy. And so like the rolling up of the Warsaw Pact was also supposed to go hand in hand with the rolling up of NATO. And, you know, the US pursued almost precisely the opposite strategy. I think that is an important backdrop for contemporary events. It's important to note, to underscore, that does not absolve Putin, who's very much a product, frankly, of the kinds of policies that emerged over the last 30 years, hence his like oligarchic multi-billionaire status, from, you know, the evils of engaging in just an imperial war of choice. But it speaks to alternative ways of conceiving political organization, where you can locate kind of nation states in confederational and federational arrangements that are able to produce perhaps like greater forms of international stability, and also can generate, you know, better instruments for wealth creation and distribution. So this is to say, like, I do think that this is it's something that needs to be revisited, and that there's a reason why, for me, like some of my greatest personal heroes from the last half century were third world, you know, Pan-Africanists and other versions of like third worldists that were committed to conceiving of self-determination as something that would only be meaningfully possible if you broke out of the very particular confines of both nationalism and the nation state structure itself.
Okay, we've got Michael.
Hi, Aziz. I thank you for the talk. I'm wondering if I'm just restating some of the previous thoughts that have been shared by you and others about multilateralism. When I think about the problem of autocracy at the level of the nation state, or a problem like the civil war in Syria, something that's troubling to me is the fact that my opinion as an American citizen is sort of more consequential than that of, say, somebody in Peru or Austria, that the determinations I make as a leftist about US policy and questions related to peace and security and the distribution of resources across the globe are afforded greater weight because of the structure of our international system, which, as you describe, has the US sort of sitting atop various institutions as a leviathan that sort of polices the order. And I wonder if we can kind of turn the question of democracy against liberal internationalists who sort of obsess about democracy at the level of the nation state and say that the only way to promote like real global democracy is to begin at the level of global governance and to maybe abstain from using our veto power in institutions like the IMF or a Security Council, and to allow other countries more of a say in sort of these collective decisions.
Yeah, thank you. And Michael, have we met previously, or have we been in conversation?
We've corresponded over email.
Yeah. So is your last name Johanna? Well, it's wonderful to put name to a face, and thanks so much for coming out. And it was great being in touch a few years back. I found those conversations really, really formative. Thank you. Yeah. So I think that this is a really good and important point. And to me, this is why the question of sanctions is actually very significant. It's one of the reasons why I was talking about it, so that we kind of think of sanctions in the present moment as it's an alternative to actual military action, and it's a way of noting one's kind of moral outrage about a specific problem. But sanctions operate post-89 in a way that's very different even than during the Cold War, because they're connected now not just to, let's say, a limitation on a specific country's ability to trade with the US, but to an entire system of secondary sanctions. And I apologize if all this stuff is familiar, which is the secondary sanctions say that if any company, or any other state from around the world wants to do business with like a sanctioned entity, they could be criminally prosecuted in the US, or, and this is the more significant thing, they'll be denied access to US financial institutions. And to the extent that the US's currency, like the dollar is the backstop, is the global currency, that basically means that the US, and here it's something that's almost always just left to the deference of the president, can pursue a sanctions policy that essentially can conscript the rest of the world, even if the rest of the world is absolutely opposed to the policy and its effects, to back positions that more or less impose something like a total economic siege. During the Cold War, yes, you had the embargo in Cuba that had really devastating effects on Cuba and was supposed to serve these propaganda purposes to highlight the socialism's impossibility. But it was nonetheless the case that those were not extended to European allies, and that Cuba also still had access to connections with, a country like the Soviet Union. And so in some ways it was more partial and contained than the framework that's emerged. And this, I think, highlights how, to me, that there's a lot of lip service behind the idea of multilateralism when it comes to American foreign policy, the sense that, multilateralism is so important to the nature of the post-war order. But in point of fact, if you take seriously the idea that if you're going to engage in policies that have systematic global effects, that in fact end up conscripting, other states and other publics to back your own security objectives, then I think it's really important that these policies are the product of meaningful multilateral diplomacy and negotiation. And that's something that the US has pretty much systematically avoided. Now, I should say that there's a way in which we have this conversation about the US. And again, part of the reason why we're having this conversation about the US is because we are located in the United States. If we were located in a different place, we'd be having a conversation, if maybe it would be about China, maybe it would be about Russia, or other kinds of states that are engaged in various troubling forms of imperial politics. So the US is not, in my view, it's not uniquely bad in terms of how it's operating, but it's nonetheless the global hegemon that we are collectively members of the polity of. And so we have a responsibility to then confront the terms by which it operates.
Okay, I think we have Noe next.
Hi, Aziz. I want to ask a slightly different question. I hope this isn't too off topic.
No problem.
Do you think the marriage between imperialism and domestic social democracy sort of delinked the American left from the labor movement? I'm thinking about how during Vietnam, a lot of unions and a lot of the working class were very hostile towards the anti-war movement. And I think it might be a little bit underrated how much that had a lasting influence on how the left went on forward to make arguments and sort of choose policy. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point, which is that, again, it was a product of, as Lee noted, that the post-war settlement that was itself a kind of imperial settlement was the product of sustained working class struggle and really intense working class struggle. So a real profound achievement. But it's also the case that by the time you get then to the 1950s, you have a traditional labor leadership that feels very invested in those achievements and also feels ideologically and effectively attached and identified with the Cold War state. So there's a way in which blacklists, anti-communist crackdowns, certainly provided a kind of strategic reason for the AFL-CIO, especially once it ends up consolidating, to essentially attack its left. I mean, so there's a strategic reason, but it's also true that, like, the Walter Reuters of the world and others, they were committed to anti-communism. They viewed the Soviet Union as a dangerous threat. They were proud of the achievements of the US. They saw real material advantages to, the kind of Cold War liberal order. And all of that created a setting in which there was not just a pragmatic reason to avoid criticizing American foreign policy abroad, but also an identification with that Cold War state. And that certainly plays out very explicitly in the context of Vietnam, and the extent to which, while you have, grassroots leftist labor activists still that are opposed to the war, that the traditional leadership of the labor movement was very hesitant to criticize. And I should say, you could make these same arguments, honestly, about the traditional civil rights movement, where there's, Mary Dudziak has a book called Cold War Civil Rights about the extent to which, for many in the traditional civil rights movement's leadership, that the Cold War was viewed as a kind of opportunity to be able to pursue racial inclusion at home. And there was an identification, Thurgood Marshall and others, with the American Cold War project overseas. And there's a reason why when in '67, King, breaks the silence in his famous speech and criticizes the war in Vietnam, that was a striking development that broke also from the traditional wing of the civil rights movement. And, this is definitely something that the left has had to contend with. And when it comes to, working class politics, I think one of the ways in which it's had to contend with it is how anti-war activism, also in the context of the 60s and since, has, for some segments of working class constituents who are invested in ideas of nation state and belonging and the genius and exceptionalism of the American project, it can read as a kind of cultural class politics that's not necessarily appreciated, that's not always appreciated, where it's like the critique of the military or the critique of American involvement gets framed or gets kind of translated as an idiom that highlights class differences in ways that end up breaking apart potential solidarities. So these are definitely persistent and real questions. Now, I should say, I do think some of that is different today. And it's one of the ways in which the Trump presidency and the Trump campaign in 2006 was really instructive, that it was telling that Trump was effectively, with respect to Clinton, the anti-war candidate. He was the person that was like, this Iraq war, whether or not, actually he'd supported the war in the first place, but this war was a bad thing. It spoke to real kind of, political resentment, especially in various kinds of rural and white working class communities. It's telling that for all of the outrage within the national security establishment about the withdrawal from Afghanistan, really the withdrawal was very politically popular across right and left. And so there is a kind of war exhaustion and anti-war politics that you can see in the US that's shared broadly, but it's interestingly not been able to be effectively joined to sort of, broad-ranging leftist intervention. That it's, this anti-war politics oftentimes, in the version that you get out of Trump is just as effectively, if not more effectively, connected to a kind of American belligerence and deep kind of militarism, rather than sort of building out a left alternative.
Right, I think we have two more people on the stack, and that'll close it out. So we've got Ashley.
Hi, thank you so much for all of this. I think that you've done a really good job of raising the questions that make internationalism so just mammoth and intimidating for me. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more. I know we've been talking about foreign policy in terms of military action of the state, but I guess I always think of one of the barriers to international solidarity being labor concerns. So where are the conflicts between what the American labor movement may view as nationalist goals around production, strengthening the labor movement here? I imagine that goes straight to outsourcing labor in terms of corporate strategies for production, and what reliance we may have already created through outsourcing and other labor markets in other countries. So I'm always thinking that those two things are inherently in contradiction with one another. I'm wondering if you can speak to whether or not you agree on that, or what your thoughts are about what kind of challenge that might pose to international solidarity between labor groups in other countries.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And it also connects actually to the success of Trump's kind of America First approach, and also to the politics around immigration, which I think we should think of as a kind of right-wing class politics, which is one of the things that's happened over the last few years with the collapse both of the post-war order as well as the kind of domestic material benefits that were supposed to come from the post-war order, is there's just mass discontent with the kind of neoliberal arrangements that were marked by transnational corporate rights, footloose capital, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But really, so far, the right's been able to play on this more effectively by telling a class story that basically that absolves business and capitalism, and instead pits working class folks and workers here domestically in the US against workers overseas or against migrants at the border. So that the problem is not the nature of the capitalist economy or the extent to which business is engaged in extracting profits in ways that actually compromise the experience of freedom for working class people everywhere. It's rather that there's the migrant at the border that's going to take your job, or there's the worker overseas, most explicitly in a country in the global south, so the non-white worker that is a threat to your own freedom in politics. And this brand of protectionism is a clear story. It provides an easy scapegoat, and it feeds a belligerent xenophobic form of ethno-nationalism. And in response, I think this is one of the real key places where you could imagine linking domestic and foreign by articulating internationalist concerns in material terms, by saying, this is, I think, an important thing. Bernie Sanders has tried to say this. I mean, it's hard to kind of get this out there through the thicket of the political debate, but that instead, the problem here for labor domestically is the nature of the global capitalist system that's built around footloose capital. So it's trade deals, but it's not just quote unquote bad trade deals. It's tax havens. It's the construction of property regimes that limit the capacity of working people everywhere to enjoy something like basic labor standards and rights and prerogatives over the terms of work. And it's also, I think, a way of countering the arguments about migration and the border, that the threats to the working class don't come from migrants, but come from business. And in fact, decriminalizing the border and strengthening the rights of migrant workers actually strengthens the position of the working class to be able to act effectively, both inside and outside of the US. you do see some of this shifting within contemporary American labor politics, especially, you know, within the traditional unions, but also within a lot of the kind of new insurgent forms of labor organizing that sort of emerged over the last half decade. The labor movement has been sort of late to kind of embrace some of this organizing, especially in the immigration domain, but it's increasingly doing so. But I do think that that's one of the key ways of linking domestic and foreign is by making clear the relationship between labor's position and transformations in the global economy and the kinds of alliances that working class people actually have both here and overseas and here at the border. And I also think it's just essential to do because there is a story that's being presented by the right that is a class story that reads in these kinds of racial scapegoating terms that's already quite powerful and has to be confronted.
We have time for one more question, I think. Irfan.
Thank you. Thank you, Aziz. This was fantastic. I guess on that note, I mean, like, so you're kind of alluding to a little bit, you know, possibilities for maybe international solidarity, because it seems international labor solidarity, because that, you know, as you remember myself, it does seem kind of grim at the moment, and it's like historically maybe even. So can you just elaborate on like the more specific examples of this happening, this international labor solidarity that you were discussing, and maybe like past examples that may also allude to like a roadmap forward for like more international labor solidarity or greater international labor solidarity?
Yeah, I mean, so the classic way that this operated in the past, I think this is one of the things that's difficult, is through party formations and labor unions that had real material strength within their own society. So even if you just go back to, for instance, like the American Socialist Party. So I've been doing, you know, a project that kind of works through the constitutional views of socialists in the early 20th century. One of the things that's really interesting to me is, like, if you read the International Socialist Review, they almost always had a section called World of Labor, where it just talked about their kind of connections with both unions and also parties everywhere. Like it could be, I mean, in South America, in Japan, in parts of Europe, and like what were the strategic programs that were being pursued. And so there was a clear sense that the world is dotted not just with nation states, because the thought was like, hey, you know, maybe one day these nation states are going to disappear, but like the world is dotted with parties that stand as almost like states outside the state, that they're kind of governments outside the government that can serve as a continuous source of intervention into domestic politics, that are organizing locally and nationally, but then have these links to international groups and then can engage in various forms of international solidarity, so that, you know, when the Haymarket riots take place, and you know there's the general strike effort May 1st, and then there's the Haymarket affair where the police come in and kill a whole bunch of workers and then that end up hanging activists on false charges, that, you know, you have the Second International that makes May 1st in honor of American workers the International Day of Workers. I mean, so that there were these particular alliances, and then they certainly persist through the first half of the 20th century. You see them also persist at the local level, even more recently, in kind of connections that have emerged. You know, for instance, this is something that this is terrible that I'm blanking on her name. Chomsky. So this is Chomsky's daughter, who's does both labor and immigration politics. I don't know if anybody can remind me of her first name.
Aviva. She's speaking to us in 2 weeks.
Aviva. Yeah, she's fantastic. So you can ask Aviva about this. Aviva has spent a bunch of time looking at, you know, rural communities in Appalachia that have attempted to organize in the context of coal mines, that have made various kinds of connections with similar types of organizing in Latin America. And so you still have had these kinds of moments, you know, so that can serve as a kind of through line to the present. To me, the best way of thinking about what the through line to the present would be, and like what, you know, where it could be strongest, honestly, is at the border. Because, you know, even in the context of the pandemic, it was notable that you have migrant workers declared as essential labor. And these are workers that in ways that are not that different than the old Jim Crow have no political rights, don't vote, have limited labor rights, and exist in a condition in which they can be permanently deported. And so we have a significant part of the working class here that are systematically disenfranchised and are thought of as not even really part of within the polity, that are a site, I think, of very significant labor organizing and activism, and that should be, I think, a very key, clear focus of left-wing politics generally, but then also of labor politics. I don't know if that was responsive, but those are some initial thoughts.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Aziz, and everyone else for all these fine questions and the fine dialogue. And now I'm going to hand it over to Mia, who will do some announcements.
Yes, please stick around for some brief announcements. Thank you so much, Aziz, for your wonderful talk, and thank you everyone for your great questions. So make sure that you RSVP for our next session, which is actually going to be our last session of this night school semester before we kick off some summer activities and reading groups, which you can stay tuned for. I hope someone from the committee will help me drop the links, but that will be, like we said, with Aviva Chomsky on foreign policy and immigration in 2 weeks, also Wednesday, also at 7. So please RSVP for that. There's also going to be a really great event this Sunday at 11 a.m. Hosted by DSA's International Committee. They're going to be launching an introductory series on global economics and trade. I think Carrington mentioned that earlier. And there's an inaugural session, The World We Have, which features Adam Getachew, Jason Hickel, and David Kotz. All are welcome, and the link is going to be dropped shortly. And as night school spring semester winds down, election season is ramping up. So if you are looking for things to plug into in North Brooklyn after you have attended all of our sessions and you're fired up and ready to talk to people about our politics in DSA, please come out and canvass with us. It is the best way to build solidarity and connections in our community. So we're going to drop the link on canvassing for Sammy Olivares, which is our NBK candidate for assembly. It's super fun. We do socials afterwards. You can meet more of your members. Please come out. And if you're not a DSA member, please consider joining DSA and paying dues. They are super important to keeping our organization running and to keeping membership democracy alive. So consider signing up for that. And there are also chapter dues for the city, which encourage more local organizing and projects, such as opening up our physical office and supporting our campaigns, fundraising, all that kind of good stuff. And if you have any feedback for us as political education, you can get in touch with us via email if you have questions. If you lose one of our RSVP links, anything like that, you can get in touch with us at nbk.poly.ed@socialist.nyc. And unless anyone else has another announcement, that should be everything for me. Thank you.
Thanks everybody for coming out. We'll see you next time. Aziz, a million thanks to you. That was wonderful.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.